God, all our lives you have been faithful. We believe that. Help our unbelief. Be with us this morning in these stories. Let us see more of your faithfulness and your goodness. Amen. So when Jeff asked me to speak on Mother's Day, it was right around the time of the women's retreat. And the women's retreat theme was, "See, I'm doing a new thing." And it comes out of this verse in Isaiah, "Behold, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the desert and streams in the wasteland." And Jeff also told me he was starting this new series on Ruth that he's done a couple of sermons in. So those two ideas were kind of swirling around in my head as I was thinking about what to preach on. This is not going to be your kind of typical Mother's Day message, but bear with me. If you Google Mother's Day scripture, I have no doubt you won't be surprised to hear one of the top hits is. And if you picked up that little half sheet of paper on your way in, it's the Proverbs 31 woman. And no doubt there are some of you in this room who have heard a Mother's Day sermon on this passage. When I was thinking about it, I asked AI, "Hey, can you turn this passage into a resume for me? Can we get a resume of kind of the perfect wife and mother out there for us to start off?" And as you can expect, it's a pretty impressive resume. So, objective: to live a life of purpose, diligence, kindness, serving my family and community with strength and honor. And then we have a super impressive list of core virtues: faithfulness, diligence, wisdom. I love this core virtue of entrepreneurship that AI threw in. Strength, charity, stewardship, and last but very much not least, work ethic. If you've read the passage, and that's why I had it printed out for you, you can read it sometime. Her work ethic gets constantly referenced. She does not eat the bread of idleness. She is working vigorously, and my favorite, rising before dawn. So clearly, she did not live summers in the Pacific Northwest. Girlfriend would have been up at 3:30. Professional experience, she's managing her own home with vigor. But on top of that, she's got several business ventures. She's purchasing fields, she's doing agricultural ventures. And then AI calls this next one artisan crafts. But verse 21 tells us she's clothing her own family in scarlet. And then verse 24 tells us she's clothing the merchants in town too. So I don't know what the merchants are doing, but she's making the linen that they're coming to buy. And then, of course, I love her references, her odd husband and children, rising up to call her blessed. But even the community is coming and meeting her at the city gates to praise what she's doing. And the whole chapter ends with these words: "Give her the reward she has earned." Give her the reward she has earned. Anyone out there feeling a little inadequate? Anyone out there feeling a lot inadequate? Now, my goal is not to put down our lovely Proverbs 31 woman. I paired her with a trophy there. In fact, in Jewish culture, this is a poem, and in Jewish culture, these verses are referred to as the Eshet Hayal, or the woman of valor. And these verses are actually sung by the husbands each week at the beginning of Shabbat on Friday night to just honor and bless and thank their wives for all that they've done. But for those of us who didn't grow up in this tradition, the Proverbs 31 woman, I think, feels a little too bright and shiny at best, and pretty daunting and even damning at worst. And I think back to the women's retreat, where women there bravely shared these stories of loss and heartbreak, stories that were gritty and imperfect, real fears, and all of us there could relate, right? With our own messy, chaotic, imperfect lives, our own painful stories. And in fact, during that session, we came up with an impromptu list of things that might make it feel like a barrier to God doing a new thing. So we have grief and loss and failure and sin, doubt, disbelief, fear, maybe your trauma or your past harms or harms you've done, betrayal, shame, lies we believe about our value and our self-worth. And added a few additional to kind of round out the list, things that might feel like a barrier to God doing a new thing. Your own feelings of inadequacy, rejection, our anger. How can God work around this anger? Our lack of belongingness or a deep loneliness, our anxiety, our utter disillusionment. This is not the life I thought I'd have. Maybe just plain exhaustion and overwhelm, or illness, hopelessness, powerlessness, and then kind of these broader things, lack of opportunity or options or systems of oppression. And this is a hard list. It's a list that represents real, lived heartache for us. And I look at the Proverbs 31 woman, and it doesn't feel like she encompasses any of this heartache. She's bright and shiny and aspirational, but she doesn't feel real, like someone I can connect with. To the contrary, in my hardest moments, I would feel small and inadequate in comparison to her. Like it's a list of achievements for the perfect mother and wife that I'll never live up to. But behold, God is doing a new thing. And one way to think about this new thing are some terms you've probably heard before. It's this idea of the old covenant versus the new covenant. So the old covenant is about the law. It's about striving and coming up short. And man, I'm a striver. It is hardcore baked into my personality to be a striver. I wrestled with it all throughout the preparation of this message, the desire to do well, to be meaningful. And people kept saying, trust God, he's in it. And I'm like, I know, but I want to do a good job, right? It's all throughout me. I can relate to striving for perfection. And under this old covenant, the Jewish people, they had to purify and cleanse themselves to even present themselves to God, right? The old covenant was striving, never living up to expectations, failure, and ultimately condemnation. But the new covenant is life. This is the new thing. The new covenant is life. And John wraps up the prologue to his gospel. The law came to Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. And it's easy to miss, but God starts the entire New Testament, the place where he's going to tell us about his new covenant, his new thing. He starts it with an absolute bang in, of all things, a genealogy. I know you were not expecting that. But let me tell you, genealogies are like the resumes of the first world, right? The ancient world. So now, first century Jewish, Palestinian society wasn't an individualistic society like ours. They were less concerned with what you had personally accomplished and a whole lot more concerned with where you came from, what your family line was. And in fact, King Herod infamously burned the public register of his own genealogy to hide his humble origins, his humble beginnings. And then he spent the rest of his life crafting a much more impressive genealogy for himself. So it's no surprise that Matthew would open his book with a genealogy of Jesus. Matthew is, in fact, our most Jewish of gospel writers, so to speak. And by that I mean his target audience was the Jewish people. So more than any other writer, he's going back to the Old Testament, and he's taking scriptures from the Old Testament, and he's weaving them into his gospel to make the case that Jesus is the promised Messiah, That's his whole goal. See these scriptures, see these prophecies? It's this guy, right? So when Matthew starts with the genealogy, it's his way of establishing Jesus' street cred, so to speak, right? This guy comes from the proper line, from the Messiah, from the family of Judah. And as far as genealogies go, Matthew lays out a very impressive one. It reads like a who's who of the Old Testament. We've got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob up there, David down at the bottom. But if you'll notice how it starts, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And that was a common way to kind of truncate a genealogy. You didn't necessarily have to list all 57 generations. That would take too long. We'll list the heavy hitters, and we'll sometimes actually literally just say, Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, you might have already noticed that right next to these names, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, there's some unusual names in there. Names we would normally expect to be erased from a family tree for the sake of propriety. Scandalous names like Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth. Now, not only are these the names of women, which I'm sure you noticed, who are in the 25 genealogies or so in the Bible, Matthew's is the only one who includes women. They lack the social status to ever be included in them, basically. But these particular women had backgrounds that would detract from the whole goal of the genealogy, right? Prestige, family prestige. And Matthew adds these 4 women knowing that his Jewish readers will know their story, knowing that none of them would be considered the esteemed women of Jewish society, that if any woman was going to make a genealogy, it would be her. And this is how the New Testament opens. And when I read these opening verses of the New Testament, it just stops me in my tracks because it makes it abundantly clear that God is doing something dramatically different from what we might expect. So different. It's not the sparkling, perfect Proverbs 31 woman. And we're going to talk about these stories this morning. We're going to turn first to Tamar, whose story is told in Genesis 38. Now, Tamar's is the story that most of you are probably the least familiar with because honestly, it is not popular church fodder. It doesn't get a lot of attention because it's a very difficult story, and I actually feel a little tender sharing it with you this morning. But if you will, let's wade into this tender place this morning. So Tamar is the daughter-in-law of Judah. Now, Judah is one of the 12 disciples that the line of Jesus comes out of. Not the 12 disciples, I'm sorry, the 12 sons of Jacob, right? The 12 tribes of Israel. And he has just been introduced in the chapter before, in chapter 37, which is a well-known passage. It's Joseph and his brothers selling him into slavery because of their jealousy of him. It's actually Judah's idea to sell him into slavery in that passage. So now we've moved from that very well-known passage into this one, which is about Judah and Tamar. And at the time, Judah has 3 sons, and the Bible says that he got a wife for his firstborn son, Er, but Er was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. And that's our introduction to Tamar. In a single breath, she gets married, and God puts her husband to death for her wickedness. What an unbelievable start to her story. And Judah, in biblical times, there was something called a levirate marriage that we also see in Ruth, where if a man dies and he doesn't have descendants, his brother will then marry his widow with the goal of the first male heir belonging to the deceased brother. So it would carry on a family line that maybe would have ended otherwise. So Judah sets it up that his second son, Onan, will marry Tamar in a levirate marriage. Of course, neither Onan or Tamar have any say in this. This is Judah's decision. And Onan, in fact, wants nothing to do with this. He doesn't like the idea that his first son will actually belong to his brother's line. And so Onan does what the Bible calls in some translations, spills his seed. He makes it so that Tamar will never get pregnant. And then the Bible tells us the Lord sees this and he finds it wicked and he kills Onan. So right off the bat, we don't know anything about Tamar's marriages, how long they were, how her husbands treated her. But we know just from these two things that there's immense grief, chaos, heartache in her story. And then Judah's a third son, and he tells Tamar, hey, wait till my third son, who's too young to even marry, grows up, and then I'll marry him to you in a levirate marriage. But Judah actually has no intention of doing this. He's completely spooked by the fact that Tamar's first two husbands died. And so he insincerely promises his third son, but he sends Tamar back to live with her parents, as was often the custom. A widow would go live with her parents. She would continue to wear the clothing of a widow. And basically, Tamar has no hope. She has no future. Nobody's going to be interested in marrying her. She's going to live the rest of her life as a childless widow in her parents' home. And she is absolutely stuck. And the years pass, and the years pass, and it becomes clear that Judah has no intention of marrying his youngest son to her. So Tamar comes up with a desperate plan. And the plan is this. She dresses herself as a prostitute. She veils herself so you can't see who it is. And she goes and she waits somewhere that she believes her father-in-law is going to pass by. And he does. And he hires her as a prostitute. And they have an exchange where she says, what will you pay me? And he says, I'll send you a goat. And she said, well, what can I have until I get the goat? And he says, I'll give you my seal and my staff. So the seal was something that all Jewish men wore. They wore it on a cord around their neck, and it was a way to stamp papers and things like that, documents, to make it known that it was you. So every seal is personal, right? This is Judah's seal. He says, I'll give you my seal and my staff. So they agree, and they sleep together. Tamar gets pregnant in this. She goes off. Judah later tries to send her the goat, but he can't find her. He doesn't know who it is, and they can't find a prostitute in that area. But 3 months later, Judah gets word that Tamar is pregnant. And according to the customs of the day, he orders that Tamar be brought out and burned alive. So Judah can go see a prostitute with zero consequences. But for the woman, the penalty is death. But Tamar's ready for this. She sends word that she's pregnant by the man who owns this seal and this staff. And Judah knows right away whose those are. And he is absolutely humbled. And he says at one point, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her my son like I promised. And ultimately, Tamar gives birth to twins. She and Judah do not live in a relationship. And one of those twins ends up carrying on the line of Jesus. Now, if we think back to that list from earlier, Tamar's story is full of these things. Absolutely full of grief and loss and shame, rejection and helplessness, total lack of options, total powerlessness in their society, these systems of oppression. There's betrayal, there's desperation, and there's ultimately deception. And I don't think any of us would have told Tamar that her plan was a good one. In fact, I think most of us would have told her it was a terrible plan. But here's the thing. God's new thing is for us. It's for us whether we do everything right and end up shattered, or whether we do everything wrong and end up shattered. God's plan is for us. We cannot mess up God's redemption story. And Tamar is the polar opposite of the Proverbs 31 woman. Yet here she is, Tamar, great, whatever, grandmother of God. And God's gathering in, his expansiveness, shown here in his own family genealogy. It's so much bigger than anything we can even begin to understand. It's so much bigger than anything we can begin. We're so hung up on merit and achievement and striving to be worthy. But God's new thing, wrapping Tamar into his family line, his very own family story. He saw Tamar when she was trapped and out of options. He saw her shame and her brokenness, and he gives her an entirely new legacy. She is no longer Tamar who's trapped or forgotten. She is Tamar, mother of God. Now, Rahab, the second woman that Matthew includes in his genealogy, her story is found in Joshua. And the setting here is the Israelites have just finished their wandering for 40 years in the desert. They've already come to this land, Canaan, before. They didn't trust that God could do it. God sent them back out for another 40 years. They are back here, and they're not going to mess up this time, right? They do not want another 40 years. So Joshua, who is the leader at this point, sends 2 spies into Jericho. Jericho is the next stronghold city that they're going to have to take. And they enter the house or inn of a woman commonly known, you've probably heard this before, as Rahab the harlot, or Rahab the prostitute. It's said like it's her whole title frequently. It's how it's listed in the Bible, and that's how you'll often hear it. And the vast majority of biblical translations use this phrase, Rahab the prostitute. But it was interesting for me to learn that the word zona that's used there doesn't only mean prostitute. It can also mean innkeeper or tavern keeper. And historians disagree over the translation of this word, though almost all biblical translations have chosen to use the phrase Rahab the prostitute. But first century historian Josephus, in his writings, refers to her solely as an innkeeper. So whether or not it's true, history has very much wrapped this element of Rahab's story into Rahab's story, right? If it wasn't her own legacy, we've certainly given her this legacy. And then more than that, we've made it her identity. So you often hear that phrase together. Now back to our story and the spies. So what happens is the spies come into Rahab's house, and the king of Jericho hears that there are probably some spies that have gone into her residence. So he sends men over who say, give us the spies. Give us these men, we think they're spies. And Rahab makes a decision. Rahab says, shoot, you just missed them. You just missed them. If you hurry real fast, you might be able to catch them. But really, Rahab has hidden the men up on her roof. And so the next part of our story from Joshua 2. Before the spies lay down for the night, Rahab went up to the roof and she said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. So what are a couple of things we know for sure from Rahab's story? Well, the first is she was absolutely terrified, and so was everyone else in town. There was no what may happen. They knew what was going to happen, and they were terrified. They'd seen what happened to the 2 cities before them. Another thing we know is that she believed, right? For it's clear your God is God in heaven and here on earth. So she was terrified, but she also believes. And Rahab aligns her actions with her belief, and she makes a plan. And ultimately, she bargains with the 2 spies, and she says, hey, I'm going to help you escape. I'm going to save your lives. But in return, when you come through, I want you to save my family. And they make an agreement that all who are in Rahab's house will be spared and passed over. So Rahab has her own list of sorrows. First of all, she's a Canaanite, So just like the Moabites, Jeff shared the other week, the Canaanites would not have been allowed to worship in the temple. She's an outsider. And of course, she's got a legacy of absolute terror, as did everyone in the town at that time. She's in a space of total desperation. What is going to happen to us? And then, of course, whether or not it's real or been applied by us, a potential legacy of shame there as well. But once again, God is doing a new thing. And Rahab, a Canaanite woman, is not one of the unnumbered dead in the fall of Jericho. She's not. She's Rahab, mother of Boaz, mother of God. She's no longer that identity we've given her, Rahab the harlot. She's now Rahab, the only woman commended in that chapter, Hebrews 11, for her faith. The only woman mentioned in that chapter. So God has given Rahab a new legacy. She's now known for her faith and certainly her courage. She was scrappy. I mean, this wasn't planned, right? The spies just showed up, and she's leaning into this faith, this belief in who God is and what's coming next. And Ruth, our third person mentioned in Matthew's genealogy. Now, Ruth's story truly starts with Naomi's story. It's one of loss right from the beginning. First, there's a famine in Judah, and it's so severe that Naomi and Elimelech, her husband, make the difficult choice to leave Judah and to go live in Moab. And they have two sons, both of whom, living in Moab, marry Moabite women. And then at some point, Elimelech dies, and then both sons die. And Naomi and her daughter-in-laws face a triple loss. So not only do they have the grief of the loss of their husbands and father-in-law, but think of the terror they must have felt when the last son died, right? They are women living in a society that gives them absolutely no prospects from this point out. They have no hope of how to make a living. And then Naomi hears that things have gotten better in Judah, and so she decides to journey back. And it was customary at this time for a widowed woman, like I said, with Tamar, to return and live with her own family, so she urges her daughter-in-laws to do the same. Go back and live with your family. But Ruth, as you know, absolutely refuses to leave her. And we're not told the reasons for Ruth's fierce devotion to Naomi, but certainly it seems as if a minimum she had an awareness of how difficult Naomi's journey back to Judah on her own would be, how difficult her life on her own as a single widow would be, how vulnerable she would be. So Ruth insists on going with Naomi, leaving her own people, adopting Naomi's people as hers, and Naomi's God as her God. And as soon as they arrive in Judah, Ruth immediately goes to glean in the fields. So Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, you notice that title there, that identity, Ruth the Moabite? Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. And Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out and entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. And as it turned out, she was working in the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech, her father-in-law. I absolutely love that line, as it turned out. Like, what a coincidence, right? What a coincidence she just ended up in Boaz's field. God was there with Ruth and Naomi. He had not abandoned them. This new thing had been part of God's plan for them from the beginning. Now, Ruth feels a little bit more like the Proverbs 31 woman to me. She's compassionate, she's generous, she's a hard worker. But hard work alone doesn't change her status as a foreigner and a widow living in a society which provided them with no options. In fact, in conversation with Boaz in that chapter, she says several things. She says, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you even notice me, a foreigner? they're invisible. Do we maybe have the same thing in our own country sometimes? And then later she says to him, "You've put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of even one of your servants." So in our multicultural society, it is a little bit hard for us to grasp how very much of a big deal Ruth's status as a foreigner was. But in Jewish society, it was significant, right? You couldn't worship in the temple. You were excluded from a lot of things. And in fact, you had the lowest standing in society, below that of servants. So as a Moabite, she has so little to give her value. But God is doing a new thing. There's Ruth's hard things. She's a Moabite. She's a foreigner with lowest standing. Grief, loss. She has a huge amount of the unknown in her story, right? Leaving her people, leaving everything she's known to come to a new place. And of course, she's working against the same systems of oppression and lack of options that all of the women in these stories have been. But God is giving her a new legacy. And I would say Ruth for us is kind of synonymous with faithfulness today, right? He's turned her foreignness, her lack of standing, into a story of Ruth's faithfulness. Not only Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi, but God's faithfulness to both Ruth and Naomi. He's given her a legacy of kindness, of family, and a future. She's no longer Ruth the Moabitess. That was her title. Multiple times in the chapter, that's how she gets introduced. She's no longer Ruth the Moabitess. Now she is Ruth, Mother of God. You guys have been hanging in with me. I know it's a lot to tell 4 of these, but we've come to our last one, Bathsheba. And Bathsheba's story is told in 2 Samuel 11 and 12. And most of you are probably familiar with this one. It's another hard one, but just for a refresher. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. And from the roof, he saw a woman bathing. Now, just a clarification here. The woman's not on a roof bathing, right? He's on the roof, and he has the vantage point of being up high. She's in her home bathing, an appropriate place, and he just can see her because of his vantage point. And the woman was extraordinarily beautiful. And David sent someone to find out about her. And the man said, "She's Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." The Bible tells us later that Uriah is in David's inner circle. He's one of his most trusted soldiers. David knows well who Uriah is. Then David sent messengers to get her. Doesn't care. She came to him, and he slept with her. She had just finished purifying herself from her monthly uncleanliness. That's why she was bathing. Then she went back home, and the woman had conceived and sent word to David saying, "I am pregnant." Whoops, I don't think I want to go there yet. All right. Oh, yes, I did. I was ready for that. So I don't know if you noticed how Bathsheba, when I put it up the first time, was mentioned in this chapter. She doesn't actually get named. She gets called Uriah's wife. And here goes Matthew again. Despite the fact that the genealogy is used for prestige and to show off the goodness of your family line, he intentionally highlights David's sin here by calling Bathsheba Uriah's wife and calling attention to that. Now, shockingly, despite a text that made it very clear that David knew who Bathsheba was, the wife of one of his inner circle, he sent for her anyway, and despite the power imbalance you might have between male and female, and the absolute power imbalance you would have because David is king and he can do anything he wants, I've personally heard people allege that Bathsheba was somehow at fault here. Maybe you've heard that too, that she somehow tempted David. And in fact, my own study Bible has this note on the chapter. Bathsheba appears to have been an unprotesting partner in this adulterous relationship with David. Yeah, you can have your reactions because what in the world? What in the world? But listen, if this stuff is still being said today, imagine what Bathsheba faced at the time. Imagine the experience of being victimized and then blamed for your own assault. And you know this is something that still happens today. Imagine the rumors that went around the court about that girl Bathsheba and the shame that came with that. And of course, the story only gets worse, right? David tries to cover up his sin, and when that fails, he has Uriah murdered. He has him sent to the front, and then his literal instructions say, then I want everyone to withdraw so Uriah dies, right? He has Uriah murdered, and then he brings Bathsheba to the palace to be his wife. Bathsheba's journey to the palace is about as far away from a fairy tale, the little fairy tales we might dream, as anyone can get. And then the eventual consequence for David's sin is that Bathsheba's son dies. She's a victim in all of this, and the consequence is extremely heartbreaking and shattering for her. Bathsheba's list of sorrows is long. She's a sexual conquest and the victim of assault. She's dealing with those systems of oppression. Her spouse is murdered. The utter betrayal of that, and how her story with David starts. Her story is full of grief and loss and trauma and harm. And then she loses a child. And yet, there is space for this, the messiest of stories, right along with Tamar's. There is space for this grief and this trauma in the genealogy of Christ, the Messiah. And Matthew's shocking decision to include this creates this huge space for us. It creates room for David's eventual forgiveness. It creates space for the humbling of a great king and the lifting up of his victim. Because there is something more for Bathsheba than victimhood and powerlessness. Because God is doing a new thing for Bathsheba. He gives her a new identity. She's no longer Bathsheba the victim. Say it with me. She's Bathsheba, mother of God. And sometimes I think this new thing, this absolutely extraordinary expansiveness of God, sometimes I think it actually feels a little hard for us in a society with such heavy emphasis on meritocracy. God's grace, his redemption, this radical gathering in, it actually can feel confusing sometimes. We prefer clean lines and neat boxes over messiness. And that God would include stories like Tamar's and Bathsheba's in the genealogy of Christ can almost feel alarming in some ways, because it absolutely upends our sense of worthiness, our understanding of what worthiness is. But that's the new thing. No longer do we have to strive to prove ourselves worthy. The God who chose to make Tamar's and Rahab's and Ruth's and Bathsheba's stories his own, who chose to make them part of his legacy, he has room for every bit of messiness in my story. This God has room for my grief, for my anger, for my disbelief, for my desperate plans, my worst plans. This God has joined us in the mess. And this list of things that feel like they could be a barrier to God doing a new thing, as we've seen in the stories today, not a single one will stop his work. In fact, he says, I am making everything new. And I like what this is paired with. Write this down, for these words are true and trustworthy. But what if you're sitting here today feeling shattered, and it just doesn't feel like God sees you or cares about you or is doing anything new in your life? You feel broken and alone, maybe feel desperate. And my words just sound like words. It doesn't feel like the truth, or it doesn't feel like they're for you. It might feel like I'm up here spouting verses, and you're sitting there paralyzed by your story. It might feel like there is no new thing for you. And that's okay if that's where you are. Because we've learned there is space for the hardest places. The Bible does not minimize or brush aside the pain and the grief and the trauma in these stories. Instead, God is entering into our hardest places through his son Jesus and through Jesus' journey to the cross. Beloved, you are not alone. You do not need to carry your story alone. This new thing is here today for each one of us, and it's here for you.